Yeah, I'll stick to time. Thanks for the welcome. Full disclosure, I'm not someone who runs integrated assessment models. This is a perspective from being, maybe I'd say, like a sophisticated user of their end products and maybe a sophisticated hater of some of the stuff that goes into them, and then also having a front row seat to some of the ways they make IPCC approval sessions more complicated. But also more evidence-based, and then some of the ways they get used in UNFCCC negotiations and national planning. All of which is to say, I think they are mostly very useful, which is the title of this talk relates to that I think it's time for an African IAM effort. And so this talk follows on from what you heard before lunch, where there's some really great presentations around clues and integrated models. And the focus here is more what I would call major integrated assessment models. So there's a handful that operate globally, that get regionalized, that are long-term institutional investments in efforts. And some of this, you'll see, hopefully I'll try and build a couple of threads to the talk following from Prof. Deborah Roberts around overshoot. And so what are integrated assessment models? Well, they're very influential for scientific assessments and for climate policy both from national levels through to global levels, such as UNFCCC decisions, things like the Paris Agreement, setting temperature targets, and countries setting NDCs, and talking about how ambitious or not they need to be at different points in time to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. And then why are they so influential? Well, they combine knowledge from multiple fields. This was talked about a bit before lunch. So things like land use, energy, economics, biodiversity, technology, climate science, increasingly also health, other parts such as consideration of informal sector, etc. So they are very large, broad modeling frameworks across lots of different systems and sectors, and they do this to analyze the interactions between human and Earth systems. We think of them a lot as climate change decision-making tools or climate change research tools, but many of them were not initially built with climate change in mind. They might have been built for decisions around locating nuclear energy facilities or talking about countries optimizing their electrical grids. And then really from the 90s onwards, as they existed already, a lot of them as energy and economy models, they became more and more important in climate change policy and research. But again, not only for climate change in the current moment, things like the biodiversity and conservation discussion, increasingly also to the extent that it intersects with climate, and we talk about co-benefits and trade-offs between mitigation and biodiversity action and conservation. Integrated assessment models are being used in those contexts too. And so there's a focus on generating useful information for decision making. And just to clarify, when I said at the start of the talk, major global IAMs, we're talking about models that have a global economy climate coverage. You could also fit in there energy, land use, other societal aspects. But on the right, you're seeing the global change analysis model, which is the one run out of the Pacific Northwest National Lab under the Department of Energy in the US. It's got about 32 geopolitical regions, and then there's also a subunit that runs for all the states of the United States. They are long-term institutional support models, the 5 or 6 major ones. They're at government agencies or national laboratories or national institutes typically, and most of them have been running for 30 or even 50 years. And they inform policy from national to global scales. And so IAMs in many ways, and the next few slides are a bit of reading, but I am an academic, so everyone do your homework for the next 3 slides, please. They're really theories of how the world works. There's this Future Models Manual, which was some artists that interacted with integrated assessment modelers for a few years, and they highlight some quotes like this one, which I think are quite good, where it's, you're weaving scientific theories together through code and computing power. And through doing this, you can then project representations of the future based on some assumptions. And some of these are kind of physical laws where we think about things like, or biophysical laws, how plants photosynthesize, how the climate responds to greenhouse gases. And others are things and theories around human behavior, such as how people change their food consumption as their income increases. We hear people talk about, oh, as your income increases, then there's a higher proportion of meat in many people's diets. But IAM outputs are also a combination of equations, assumptions, and narratives. And so some things can be explained using these laws around the climate physics and the biophysics of the world. And other things are often better explained in words, right? Or at least when we're talking initially and ideating. And so IAMs are often including a lot of storylines describing how society might work in the future. So a lot of an IAM output is often generated dynamically in the model, but certain other things can be hard-coded in depending on what a group of people think is consistent with the storyline of the future, right? A certain democratic or autocratic governance procedure. How long will that last into the future? What will the world look like in 2050 or 2100 if that persists? And it's often those narratives, even though they weren't originally intended that way, that end up shaping current climate negotiations at the global level, where we're talking about, are we in this kind of a world or that? Many of you hear of the shared socioeconomic pathways, right? There are many other narratives that you can put into an IAM, but often those global narratives are the ones that really shape our global policy discourse. And so to have an IAM in that context is quite a powerful thing to have as a region or as a country. And yet there's an African gap in IAMs. That underlying map there is the map of, in red dots, centers, and colored in blue, countries that are members of the Integrated Assessment Modeling, the International Consortium. Unfortunately for Africa, not a single country or member yet. And this is something I think that definitely needs rectifying urgently. And so one of the reasons Africa is included in IAMs is because we are critical for the global climate change mitigation and adaptation effort, and yet we don't have an African-led IAM equivalent to other major global IAMs, and this means that a lot of integrated assessment modeling work that's done about co-benefits and trade-offs between land, water, energy, different mitigation strategies, those narratives and storylines that are put through models are largely produced by modeling groups in the global north. In many cases, that is very good science, but when you're not the one driving the integrated assessment model, your African storyline could often be lower down the priority list of the storylines that get run in any month or year on high-performance computers and in other contexts of resource constraints, right? And so why is this a problem? To really get a bit more into the weeds, we talk a lot about pathways to limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And what you're seeing on the slide here is partly a synthesis of a model intercomparison project between many of those 5 large global integrated assessment models that's reflected in the IPCC synthesis report, where I was one of the main facilitators. And there was this figure, it's not quite as it was finally reflected in the report, right? It went through so much editing and line management and back and forth, partly with countries like India. You have some fundamental disagreements with the assumptions and storylines that went into these IAMs that largely come out of the EU, Japan, and the USA, right? And so orange, there's the greenhouse gas trajectory projected by integrated assessment models under current policies as of 2020. The purple line is what would happen with NDC pledges, not the most recent updated ones, but a generation before. And the green and blue lines is just how rapid the greenhouse gas emissions reduction has to be to stay likely around 1.5, or in the case of green, 2 degrees Celsius. So we get these numbers like global greenhouse gas emissions for 2 degrees Celsius would have to peak by 2025 last year at the latest, and drop by around 30% by 2030. That's an output of a model intercomparison effort of all these IAMs. Again, Africa did not have an IAM in that, right? And so when we start taking these global numbers and then downscaling them to regions and countries, my argument here is it's important for Africa to have a seat at the initial integrated assessment modeling table where the storylines go into this. And then things can get more granular. So you can start talking not just about how much to reduce emissions, but what is the timing of different types of action. The green line on this chart shows that emissions from the land use sector in an integrated assessment model, model intercomparison synthesis here, that's the optimal way in terms of cost efficiency is to reduce those fastest. That's largely by reducing tropical deforestation, eliminating deforestation from supply chains. Then the electricity sector goes next. And that's because a decarbonized electricity sector helps to decarbonize other sectors such as transport and industry. And so this has clear implications as well in an African context, right? This is a global least cost pathway. And one of the things that gets talked about a lot in the land use sector is nature-based solutions and mitigation. Afforestation is very contested in some parts of Africa. And integrated assessment models, these major global ones, like to plant a lot of trees in Africa because land is cheaper here than it is in the global north. And so you end up with an assessment done like this, where in green there are the grassy biomes of Africa. That is savannas, grasslands, they're key for livestock grazing, they're really important for our ecotourism industries. And in purple is a combination of satellite imagery and integrated assessment model outputs from European IAMs that shows where you could plant a tree for mitigation. And if you look in South Africa, basically the whole of the Kruger Park would be available for afforestation, right? Clearly that's infeasible. And I'm not picking specifically on IAMs here because all models have limits and all of them need to be constrained to be more reasonable within a national or subnational context. But again, the point is, I would hypothesize were African decision makers and scientists driving an African-led global IAM, we might have constrained this optimization differently and said, let's take African grassy biomes that are ancient ecosystems important for livelihoods and biodiversities and say, where else might we plant the trees, even if it costs a little more, and is that still a feasible mitigation pathway to the land use sector going so fast on decarbonization? So what we have at the moment is really powerful and important models for climate policy and science, and yet they produce very contested futures, right? And so there's a lot of decision-making distrust in the global south around the existing global integrated assessment models, and this we see play out often at COPs, when certain G7 countries and others meet with certain global south delegations and their discussions around the science says this, and then the contestation is, well, that made the incorrect assumption. Okay, can you show me your science that says something else? No, I don't have an integrated assessment model with which to do that. And it kind of frustratingly, we go round and round in the science where I would contest what we should really be doing is getting beyond the science and talking to the politics. And one of the things that would help that is having a more democratized and more diverse integrated assessment modeling system. And so why does Africa need an IAM urgently? Well, we need to produce better national, regional, and global climate policy analysis that reflects African realities and priorities. So for example, African priorities of a just transition in global scenarios, right? There might be different scenarios and storylines to put in there around how fast we go in decarbonizing major source point pollutants compared to the jobs at risk of doing that. Are you trying to maximize jobs and skills retraining and reduce unemployment through that restructuring, or are you trying to shut, this is a JET-P conversation, for example, right? Like, are you trying to shut off power plants as fast as possible? There are plenty of models that can start to answer that in South Africa, and we've heard really good presentations on that. But when you scale up to like Africa as a region, how we interact as African countries, how that looks in the context of global decarbonization pathways, that's where these IAMs come in. The informal sector, many of the existing IAMs are built in countries that don't have much of an informal sector or don't think much about informality at all. And yet in African cities and African economies, the informal sector is often the biggest part of the picture by number of people. And so that's something we could do better on. Livelihoods. Most African agriculture is rain-fed. There is a lot of indigenous and local knowledge involved in a lot of our agricultural systems. Those are not well represented in existing integrated assessment models that might skew more towards large mechanized farming around certain staple crops. Again, it's not like the IAM groups that exist today are unaware of this. It's just that they also have limited resources, and when they do their scientific prioritization, they're not always going to be prioritizing the sectors and the things that are important from an African perspective, right? So we talked a little bit about food security and trade-offs in things like livestock with afforestation, also ecosystems. Many African ecosystems have evolved to have regular wildfire, right? That is not something well represented in existing integrated assessment models. And in many cases for good reason, right? There aren't large wildfire, well, more recently there are, but very different like histories of fire and fire management in parts of Europe, for example, to parts of Africa. So that doesn't need to be in an IAM, but in an African context, it's something we would probably want to invest more in representing better at the IAM stage. And then African mitigation and adaptation feasibilities are storylines, are assumptions. And so to lead you on that last point where we talk about mitigation and adaptation feasibility, a quote I like from an IASA integrated assessment modeler is, models can only be as radical as our assumptions. And so if you're not the one driving the assumptions through your own consultative process and having an integrated assessment model to feed it in, it's difficult to have a strong voice at that table around mitigation and adaptation feasibility. And so one that I'm sure is often familiar to many of us in this room, right, when we talk climate policy, is vegan or vegetarian diets. So we could have like, who would think, okay, it's feasible as an African mitigation and adaptation pathway to have like 80% or 90% vegan diets across the continent by the 2040s? Any hands up? I'm not seeing many. But these are the kinds of things that you could explore from a more African perspective, right? Many of the CDR technologies, ocean alkalization, afforestation, direct air capture, what do we think the cost per ton CO2 are according to economic models in our continent's context with often lags in technology deployment? What do we think differences are in ownership of intellectual property of those and licensing? We know with JETP, for example, that's something that's often a challenge. Technology dependency of different donor countries saying you should use this rather than necessarily the cheapest technology option. That could lead to strong differences in development pathway preferences. And then here's a bit of a neutron bomb of climate change response, right, that I wouldn't put in the mitigation or adaptation bucket, but solar geoengineering, something that's very relevant again with CDR in parts of the overshoot conversation. What are African perspectives on the feasibility of that? What kind of storylines would we want to tell around who is deploying or not deploying those technologies when they get put inevitably into an integrated assessment model and become more important as a part of climate policy discourse? And so with an IAM that is African-led, Africa could set research and policy agendas on climate and development pathways, continent, region, as well as globally. And then we could more accurately understand African co-benefits and trade-offs of climate and development action. For example, trade-offs between different dietary choices, livestock farming, ecotourism, local sustainable livelihoods and subsistence farming, trade-offs in employment generation opportunities between the informal sector, the formal sector, different energy deployment pathways. So these are very versatile models. And I would argue not just Africa, but the world actually needs an African IAM urgently. And that's because it enables more equitable climate and development policy dialogue with partners. Right now, there's this quite uneven, inequitable context of the science says this and a rejection of it from a lot of global south countries, as opposed to their ability to come with their own science and reach consensus and search for synthesis of the most salient outputs, where you're asking different assumptions around feeding what it means to live a livable and sustainable life in an African context. There are some fundamental, which we might regard as radical assumptions in current IAM storylines about the rate at which poverty is reduced in Africa or consumption catches up with the global north, where in keeping the world below 2 degrees Celsius, the truth is it doesn't catch up with consumption in the global north. It doesn't even get close. Is that something we would want to run a different scenario and say, what if it did? Or what if it didn't, but everyone's consumption dropped to some extent to be more sustainable? To ask questions like that is very useful in a climate policy context. And to get there with numbers does, in some cases, move the policy discussion and the decision-making discussion forward. And so it's not just to have that policy dialogue for the sake of it, but it's to actually enable more effective and evidence-based decisions to secure a sustainable and livable future for all people. So that's why I think if investing in this, it's not just for Africa's benefit, it's actually for global climate change decision making, that it's a benefit that Africa have a global IAM. And so the last part of the talk here is sort of thinking of this not just as research and science and policy, but actually as science policy infrastructure that's very impactful. And so in South Africa, at least, we're used to some, in recent memory, large science mega projects. This is the Karoo Array Telescope. It's a large radio telescope. But we don't often think of things like this, the decades of effort of hundreds of researchers to put in like hundreds of thousands of lines of code as science infrastructure. And I think we should in the same way. And behind that code is lots and lots of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, integrative science policy discussions, storytelling, scenarios. And the cost, this is a rough estimate for an African IAM investment, would be something between 35 and 70 million US dollars over a decade. I would argue that's extremely cheap. This telescope cost $350 million. We're talking about a livable and sustainable future for billions of people. $70 million over a decade, in the context of just our JET-P pledges as well, that's like, it's not that much money, really. And so what you're getting is an integrative, transformative, impactful, and long-lasting infrastructure. It's linking policymakers, practitioners, people like health practitioners, if Africa chose to emphasize that. For example, data scientists, and also a lot of, at the bottom there, just collaborative teamwork across different African countries, different researchers, different disciplines, and different parts of policy. And it's delivering training. It would have to have a large data and compute infrastructure, of course. It would have a research program for a global IAM from an African perspective. It would have to have a large science policy program so that it's decision relevant. And is changing with the times as climate change and geopolitics evolve. And then I would argue it would attract continued investment. Because right now, without having an African-led IAM, if someone comes along and says, okay, we've got 5 or 10 million pounds and we really want to better represent health in low-income countries in IAMs, they go and put that in one of the 5 major IAMs in Germany or the Netherlands or Austria or the USA or Japan, because we don't have an African IAM to absorb that investment and build on our existing infrastructure. So I would argue that once a piece of infrastructure like this exists, it can attract further investment to get better and better at the job and get better and better at answering different climate policy and development policy questions as time evolves. And so some people would say, okay, why not just take one off the shelf from somewhere else and tweak it? You could do that a lot cheaper and a lot faster. And yes, I think that should be, but it's just a baby step at the beginning, right? A lot of this is about the resources to actually build one, making different assumptions right from the beginning that reflects an African reality, an African possibility, and an African priority. A second one is you're doing that so that you can represent systems important for Africa. And some of the existing IAMs have land use and biodiversity sectors that might make a lot of sense to more cheaply adapt and build in the wildfire component. Obviously, we need to learn from all the excellent work that's been done over decades in many of those other groups. But we ideally would have the resources to build new modules where needed. And then that would enable modeling of African storylines, and I would hope discovering some new solutions by doing this in an African context and potentially new solution pathways in a global context that might look quite different as the current political moment, I think, requires from what we've been doing for the last couple of decades. And then it would strengthen the science policy interface, and it would also build future generations of research and science policy capacity across the continent. To have a piece of infrastructure like this is a massive training engine for master's students, PhDs, postdocs, but also people who exit after a master's into the knowledge brokering, the intermediary space between science and policy. So to conclude, and then happy to go to questions, I think it's time for an African IAM. Thank you. Yeah, if anyone has questions, very happy to. Yes.
Thank you for such an illuminating presentation. My question is on, I think your presentation was more on an Afrocentric perspective. So then my question is, how do we ensure that the outputs from IMS, we're able to translate them into policy, you know? How do we ensure that we can translate them into an effective policy that will benefit Africa?
Okay, so I think there are a lot of good examples already of where integrated assessment model output is setting policy and being used to inform policy, and a lot of that is in the very messy world of UNFCCC negotiations, for example. So things like driving ambition around NDCs, around what the sort of highest ambition should be in order to be on track for 2 degrees or 1.5. A lot of that comes out originally from IAMs. A lot of the discussion around carbon dioxide removal technologies. So it's not that it's directly in every instance the outcome of an IAM is leading to a policy decision, but often they frame sort of the art of what might be possible under climate futures. So things like overshoot pathways, where it's how much carbon dioxide removal would be needed to bring global temperatures back down, the models answering those questions and suggesting that it might be this much deforestation, that much ocean alkalization, etc., are integrated assessment models. I think in an African context, you could dedicate compute, you could prioritize to dedicate compute differently, right? So you run a global one, which you contribute into things like IPCC scenario databases, but you can also choose, it's right at the beginning of my talk, so I won't go back to it now. But there was a picture of GCAM I showed that it sliced the world into 32 regions and then the US into 51 states, right? An African IAM could slice the world into 32 regions and then have every country in Africa represented, or have sub-regions of African countries represented, and ask more detailed questions there about co-benefits and trade-offs of decisions around, say, hydropower infrastructure, for example. And so I think a lot of it in the messy world of policymaking is an IAM is not predicting the future and saying this is the best outcome, but it's saying if you want to do something like this, then it might lead to a world like that. And then there's a policy discussion around, do you want that world? Do you maybe want something different? And how effective, the effectiveness of a lot of that policy, I think has to be linked with an ecosystem at a subnational scale of some of the stuff we were hearing earlier around the micro modeling. This is not trying to replace like a subnational energy model in South Africa, for example. It's an extra thing in the climate policy framework. Yeah. I think it was Steve, and then back to this table. And are there any questions on this side? Sorry, I'm not. Yeah. I can't. The room is so long and wide. It's a bit of okay.
I'm looking for questions aside.
Sure.
Yeah. So I guess one of the potential shortfalls of Africa IAM is that South Africa would be the US of Africa, right? Like, how do we govern this in such a way that everyone has have you thought about that? Just your thoughts on how do we govern this so that every African country has a reasonable and equal say in this IAM process?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important question. There have not been detailed discussions on that. I mean, this isn't like it's an official endorsed effort, right? It's a lot of it is parts of the research community in South Africa and elsewhere saying this should be a thing, and policymakers in many cases agreeing. I think there are good examples, plenty of good examples of Pan-African collaboration on science, like even that telescope, the Karoo Ray telescope, right? Like in its upgrade to SKA, there are dishes that sit in places like Ghana, for example. I think from a training and capacity development perspective, it would have to have like seats for multiple African countries in that context. The compute in the age of cloud computing, right? That compute could be distributed, it could be based in lots of different places. There are scientific advisory and governance committees that could be made up of people of multiple different countries. I think one of the things in seeing it that could be a challenge, it depends on how you design, but if specific countries or regional blocks have specific policy questions that they want the IAM to answer, then how do you prioritize whose storylines get run? I think there's as much a political as there is a scientific question around designing an optimal strategy for equitable runtime on the model as you build it. Yeah.
Shall I go first?
Sure. I think your hand was
Yeah.
first, and then
Okay. Chris, thank you. This was excellent. I'm from a distance, I like the IAMs. I like the role they play in their own way, similar to microsims and CG, and it's a very important quantitative tool, but also storytelling tool that matters, as you've mentioned, at that highest levels. And so the concept of having a voice in that would be incredibly important. But and then it links to Steve's question. Okay, what's the next step? How do we get there? From what can I do when I go home, tell my students in terms of this is what's happening. So I want to ask a little bit in terms of, say, the intellectual basis starting point for your IAMs. Are they closely related to, for example, the Rice Dice models of a Nordhaus, or is there other schools of thought in this that provides entry points to this? And how many are there, type of thing. So what do we need to look for when we want to get started? And then I think just as perhaps an idea, I'm not sure how many of us are aware of the Coalition for Finance Ministers for Climate Action, right, which is run by not the Danish. I always get, yeah, anyway. The US used to be a big part until Trump got elected again. So anyway, so they're a big collaborative group, many countries around the world. There's about 20 odd African countries signed up. And there's now a Pan-African version of this, which was established last year. They're still kind of finding their feet. And they are working closely with the Ugandans there, who has a Center for Excellence on Climate-Sensitive Macroeconomic Modeling, which I attended their first big African symposium 2 weeks ago. And so I'm just saying this to create a bit of awareness, as maybe these are institutional frameworks which has already been set up, which could be used to push and get institutional support to develop something like an African IAM. Because IAMs were presented at this symposium, also from international people attending. And so there is a general awareness of this tool there. There is a demand for developing it and capacity building, etc. So I'm just putting it out there as maybe something to explore in helping getting this done. Because, as I always say, I don't want to be at next year's conference and nothing else has happened and we have the same talk again, right? So between all these sponsors on the screen, I think there needs to then be a collective kind of responsibility and guidance in this, because this is the one big underdeveloped tool, right? As you've obviously highlighted now. So
maybe a few quick comments on that. I think, they're really good questions. One, I think to get involved in terms of the skill building, there's a lot of people in a lot of different research institutions across Africa that already have many of the necessary skills. I think we do have to recognize that there's also a skill shortage, though. So you wouldn't, for example, necessarily want to have everyone who's doing really important national level energy modeling reallocated to an IAM effort at a moment where the energy transition is critical. So we do need this as an engine to train more people, and yet the diversity of modeling that is represented in an African IAM, like others, our priorities would be different, mean that people from ecology backgrounds can get involved, agriculture modeling backgrounds, economic climate backgrounds. So for example, an African IAM that's looking at questions around biodiversity and climate, it would be as important that you have really good ecological models around species richness and ecosystem health as you do around things like Rice and Dice model that you mentioned. The Rice and Dice is a level below of what this is. Like these things would be more closer. Some of them use CGE, some of the major ones, but many of them use even more like close to agent-based modeling frameworks and simulations in some cases. To represent that number of regions at the granularity they do. I think a second, just quick comment is to be seen as a piece of African science infrastructure, of course, there's a large governance challenge there. And I think there's a question there about how much a resource allocation, enthusiasm for that kind of resource allocation from certain global north partners would drive leveraging of some of that from African governments, right? And so I think ideally, it wouldn't be the sole ownership of a single university anywhere on the continent, but it would be a consortium that would manage it. That would then result in it being more representative of priorities, hopefully more representative of priorities across the continent. Because you could imagine, okay, we're in a rush, we need to do this quickly, here's a high resource environment at a particular university with a link to a donor, let's go. I would argue that a long term is a riskier prospect than taking maybe a little more time up front to have a multi-research institution consortium running something like this. Yeah.
Thank you. And good afternoon. My name is Conrad Ntsesa from Botswana. When you started and as you went through the presentation, I was excited until you answered that question that Steve asked. And the reason why that is the case is because I think we need to spend as much time on understanding the key policy questions that need to be answered. Perhaps the reason why we don't have an African IAM is because we never spent as much time to understand what Africans really believe about climate and whether it is priority for them. And if it is priority for them, what are the key questions that they would like to see answered? So I thought I would throw that in because when you started, you spoke about global IAMs, and then during negotiations, there's contests, and this is where contests arise. Because I don't know, I don't see, I don't understand, I hear about this that we should do, and because it is seemingly important. Yes, there's governance challenges, but I think many times modeling exercises gloss over governance challenges, and that is why then key tools that are important then end up not being used as effectively or not being used at all. So I think there is substance in the question that Steve asked, and we really need to put more focus into what we should do. Thank you.
Yeah, a quick response to that is I fully agree. I think one of the things that an effort like this would be exciting for is that it would create a lot of convening power for exactly that conversation. At the same time, having been on a UNFCCC delegation for a couple of different African countries, I'd say many of our bureaucrats have very sophisticated questions around some of that policy that they use to criticize the existing IAMs that are being run in Europe and the US, for example. And so I think having an African IAM could start to quite quickly answer some of those questions around, for example, trade-offs between food security and the pace of mitigation, trade-offs between land use for mitigation through tree planting versus land use for other types of livelihoods. So I think we already have a good idea, and an investment in an IAM would hopefully create the convening power, and absolutely it would have to have a huge investment in policy synthesis to crystallize those into the most important ones to focus on for a modeling effort. Yeah, fully agree.
There's one more question that side, and then we can wrap up.
Okay, last question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that very thought-provoking presentation. I had a few thoughts arising from that. Firstly, it's about the global comparisonness of an African IAM, if we were to go in that direction. Because I think one of the reasons why similar methodologies are used across the globe is to try and understand who is maybe emitting what and how much should each of these parties that are emitting more be able to do so that you contribute to the mitigation. So how would that play in the overall global conversation if we had a separate methodology that looked at IAMs for Africa and then we have different ones for different areas? Then I also wanted to hear your thoughts on the existence of, say, national models for particular IAMs like clues. I think there was a very interesting presentation in the morning on developing a national model for clues for South Africa. It's something we're doing also in Zambia. So I understand that maybe over time there could be a number of these national models that are specific to particular countries. How does that fit into the conversation of having Africa-specific IAMs? I just wanted you to reflect on that. Then maybe finally, I also wanted to understand what pathway would you propose if we went in this direction? Sometimes what prevents us from going in this direction is we receive funding from outside and methodologies developed and we just fit in. Even the NDCs that we produce, even as countries, come with an IPCC inventory methodology that we just follow. And sometimes even that inventory methodology is regional. I was privileged enough to have been one of the key authors of the Zambian NDC and the Namibian NDC. And one of the things we've been using, in Tier 1 particularly, we actually use regional data. And as I think Steve mentioned, South Africa usually boosts our emissions up rather than representing the emissions from different countries. And so we have this model that does not really represent country-specific data, even if we are using data that we are saying is regional. So how do you think the correct pathway would be if we went with an IAM that is Africa-specific? Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll try to keep it very brief because I know the next speaker has to go. So quick, on the methods and diversity, I think in many ways that's welcomed. So the existing 5 or 6 major global IAMs, or they might have some similar outputs, but those models are super different in their methods. There's very little consistent methodology. Some of them model the land use sector in a completely different way from others, or originally energy models, while others started as economy models. So often they don't even get easily compared side by side in certain contexts. So I don't think customizing something to African realities in that context is a challenge. On clues and the national level IAMs, I think it's very complementary, especially in 2 contexts, well 3. One is around identifying priority questions. Another one is building and curating data sets and data sets for scenarios. There's a lot of complementarity there. And then the third one is around developing skills and just general like computational and policy and science literacy in this IAM space. And then on the thing around NDCs and data inventories, I think again another way that an effort like this over time could help is by pointing out data gaps and opportunities for future investment that are really needed, not just in the IAM context, but also at lots of national and subnational levels. Thanks.